Okay, we're still continuing Perek Tshuva, the listing of the people who do not have a share in Olam Haba, and we are at the very end of the Kofrim Torah issue. Kofrim Torah has three categories. One is a person who says that even a single letter of the Torah did not come from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it on his own, and Kal V'chomer if you say somebody else wrote it later, and it was not divine, so that's considered to be a Kofrim Torah. So that's referring to the text of the Torah Shebichsav. Yeah.
Aren't there certain opinions that say that possibly the very end was written by the Nevi'im?
Well, yes. Well, not Nevi'im. There is a machlokas in the Gemara regarding the last 8 verses of the Torah. Right, the last 8 verses of the Torah talk about Moshe Rabbeinu's death. So, did Moshe Rabbeinu write the last 8 verses of the Torah? So, there's a machlokas in the Gemara if Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it or Yehoshua wrote it after Moshe's death. So, I think you have to say that the Rambam is not saying Mosaic authorship is an Ikar Emunah. What he's saying is divine dictation is an Ikar Emunah. So so maybe the last 8 verses, Yoshua heard from Hashem as opposed to Moshe. In other words, the way the Rambam words it, Moshe is only mentioned in the negative. Anyone who says that Moshe wrote it mipi atzmo and not mipi Hashem, that would be a violation of the Ikar. But if I say it's al pi Hashem, but Yoshua wrote the last 8 verses, that would be okay. In other words, that's an interesting point. The Mosaic authorship of every single pasuk is lav dafka going to be an Ikar Emunah itself. Now again, I have to say every time we do this, we are going over the Rambam Shita. Remember that there will be other opinions about this, and that always creates a conundrum. That creates a problem of circularity, because the Rambam is defining those who argue with him as an apikoros or a kofir or ein lo chelek l'olam haba. That's a pretty powerful ad hominem argument. You can't say what you're saying because you're an apikoros, but they say they're not an apikoros. Whatever. Okay, well, maybe we'll get back to that. Now, the next two are Torah Shebal Peh denials of Torah Shebal Peh. And again, let me just remind you that historically this is very, very, very important, because the Rambam lived in a time and in a place where the Karaite movement was actually very powerful. Today, Karaites are almost extinct. Not quite extinct. There are Karaites, in Israel, in America. They even have websites. I wouldn't encourage you to check it out necessarily, because a lot of what they teach is obviously Kafira, but Karaite is not a big movement. It's not a growing movement and the like. But in the Rambam's time, it posed a genuine threat to what we would call today Torah Judaism. And the basis of Karaitism, or Karaim, quite literally is, Karaim means Bible people. Kra, meaning they only look to the Torah Shebichsav as a source of authority, and they denied the Torah Shebal Peh. And they were particularly large in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. And in the Rambam's own community, there were many, many, many Karaim, and therefore the Rambam will often devote a lot of time and space to deal with Karaite heresies and why a religious Jew cannot be a Karaite. This was more important in the Rambam's place than why can't a religious Jew be a Christian. There weren't that many Christians in Egypt. There were many, many Karaites, and the Rambam had to deal with them. Now, it's interesting that Karaitism, we can date it. It actually, it's an invented movement. It's not like an old tradition that goes back to Har Sinai, in which some did not accept Torah Shebal Peh. First of all, just as a matter of definition, let me just define some terms for you. We have in the Mishnah and in the Tosefta, we have references to people who are called Saddukim. Right? These are in English the Sadducees versus the Pharisees or the Prussian. In the Christian Bible, the Pharisees are the bad guys, But in our tradition, the Pharisees are the good guys. The Pharisees are who we would call Chazal, Mamish, called Prushim. And one of the main differences in Stukim and Prushim is that the Stukim, too, did not accept the Torah Shebaal Peh. So people sometimes make a mistake and they think Stukim and Karaites are the same group of people. Not really. They have a different origin. The Stukim existed in the time of the Bayis Sheni. They existed during the second Beis Hamikdash. And the reason they're simply called Stukim is the founder of the movement was a person who was called Tzadok. His name was Tzadok, not to be confused with the Tana Rebbe Tzadok, who was a great, great tzaddik. This was another tzaddik who obviously was not as great of a tzaddik. Now, the Stukim also had an agenda of not accepting the Sanhedrin, not accepting the Torah Shebaal Peh, of interpreting the Torah literally. But it's interesting, I mean, you could speculate about this, that a lot of the motivation of the Stukim was actually more political and economic. It was not so much a religious philosophy. For example, many of the Stukim were rich, prosperous, they were very successful, and they were Hellenistic in their orientation. In other words, the Stukim arose during the Hellenistic period of the Greek rule over Eretz Yisrael, both pre-Hanukkah and post-Hanukkah, I mean, in both situations. And as a result, they were not looking for a stricter version of Judaism. The other way around, they were looking for a more relaxed version of Judaism. So not doing work on Shabbos would have meant, you don't go to the movies, whatever it is, but you don't have to keep the 39 malachas. Now, Stukim as a movement were essentially extinct with the Churban Bayis Sheni. That when the Romans destroyed the Beis Hamikdash in the year 70, for some reason, the Stukim just got kaput, meaning there were no Stukim anymore. The Prushim, or our Chazal, together with the Amei Haaretz, the Amoratzim, together with Amoratzim, they kind of survived and they became the Jewish people. So, were there individuals who still subscribed to that philosophy? Surely yes. I mean, there must have been some individuals there, but there was no movement called Sadukim after the Churban Bayis Sheni. In fact, even the word Prushim got dropped, meaning the ideas that the Prushim stood for became the ideas of the Tanoim, the Amoraim, etc., but they weren't called Prushim anymore, because you're only called Prushim when you have Stukim. So when there are no Stukim, there are no Prushim, we simply have Chazal or Tanoim, Amoraim, or whatever it would be. Now, Karaites, you might call, is almost a Techias HaMesim of the Stukim, but many, many years later, you're talking about around the 10th century, the 900s. Although the Karaites ostensibly had a philosophy, a religious philosophy, to deny the authenticity and authority of the oral law, in point of fact, the genesis of the Karaites were not in religious philosophy, but in simply job dissatisfaction. There was a particular person, Anan ben David, who wanted a certain position, and when he didn't get that position within the rabbinic community, he broke away and started his own religion. We know this is documented, and basically we know that in the period of the Gaonim, there were two great yeshivos. These were holdovers from the times of the Amoraim of the Gemara. There was the yeshiva of Sura and the yeshiva of Pumbedisa. Sura was the larger yeshiva, and the technical name for the heads of these yeshivos were Gaonim, Gaon, which means excellency. So even if you were a great, great Talmid Chacham, and today we use the word Gaon for a great Talmid Chacham, and sometimes not even such a great Talmid Chacham, everybody is a Gaon today. But technically, the only person that was a Gaon was the head of these two yeshivos. But there was another position within the Jewish community, which was a political position. Again, this is referred to in the Gemara, but it did exist in the time of the Gaonim as well. And that was the position of Resh Galusa, which literally means the head of the exile. He was the political leader of the Jewish community, and he was the intermediary with the Persian or Babylonian authorities. Anan ben David was not seeking a position as a Gaon, but he was seeking a position as Reish Galusa. And when that position was denied to him in favor of someone else, in protest he broke away, started a new movement called Karaitism, and eventually the Karaim grew and grew and grew. So in spite of the fact that there is a certain claim of some type of philosophical and religious lineage, it was simply invented by Anan ben David after he did not receive the position of Reish Galusa. Now, it is true that ideologically it has many similarities to Tzdukim, but it's not direct. There were hundreds and hundreds of years between the last Tzdukim and the rise of Karaitism. So, because the Karaim did not learn, essentially, Gemara and Mishnah, they did not accept it as authoritative over the years, so their text was Tanakh. And because of this, they actually developed a certain expertise. They became very, very expert in Tanakh and expert in Diktuk. So one of the strange phenomenon that you have is that sometimes some of our Meforshim will bring Karaite commentaries on the Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ukesuvim, because if they felt that those were good grammatical observations, they were willing to do this. The Ibn Ezra will sometimes bring Karaim. The Abarbanel will sometimes bring Karaim. As far as I know, Rashi, Rambam never bring them, but the Ibn Ezra, Abarbanel will sometimes bring Karaite interpretations, sometimes to argue with them and sometimes to endorse them. In fact, the Abarbanel, although I don't think the Ibn Ezra did, the Abarbanel even brings Christian interpretations. Sometimes. In fact, there is a story they tell about Rav Hai Gaon, who was after Rav Sadia Gaon, so Karaitism was already there. Rav Hai Gaon was the last of the Gaonim, because after him, the yeshivas were destroyed, and we then enter the period of Rishonim. Rabbeinu Gershom is like the first Rishon, and the like. But they tell a story about Rav Hai Gaon that his yeshiva was across the street from a monastery, apparently, and he was learning Nach, Nevi'im, with his Talmidim. So the Rebbe used to give a shir in Nevi'im, and at some point there was some difficulty exactly what a certain phrase meant. So Rav Hai Gaon told one of his Talmidim, go across the street and see what they say. In other words, go and ask them how they interpret these verses, because obviously the early Christians, knew Hebrew very well. That could have been their native language. So the Talmud didn't know what to do. He was frozen in place. He was just stared at Rav Hai Gaon, like, what are you asking me to do? And Rav Hai Gaon, the story goes, it may be a story, I don't know if it's true, but it's brought down in Svarim. Rav Hai Gaon told him, do you think that because they're Christians or because they're idol worshippers, they don't have correct knowledge of Diktuk? Kabel emes mimisha amro, we should be makabel the truth from whoever tells us the truth and go see what they say. So Karaites are the same thing. On one hand, Karaites clearly fall under the category of Kofrim Torah, according to the Rambam's second definition, that they deny the validity of Torah Shebal Peh. But in the area of their expertise, we are permitted to learn from them. Now, another interesting thing is, this book is actually available in English in a reprint edition. If you've ever had the unfortunate experience of being confronted with a Christian missionary or a Messianic Jew or whatever it is, and they will bring you all sorts of biblical verses that maybe you never learned before. Well, what do you do with Isaiah 53, and everything else. So one of the most effective anti-missionary books ever written, in terms of telling you what these verses mean, telling you what is Isaiah 53, what is Daniel, what is this, and showing you the Jewish interpretation of these verses, is a sefer called Chizuk Emunah, Strengthening the Faith, that was written in Hebrew, but has been translated in English, and it's available. And it was written by a Karaite, because the Karaite does not use any chazals, which actually makes perfect sense if you think about it, because let's say you're debating a Christian, not that you should, and the Christian says, Isaiah 53 says this, so you say, well, the Medrash says this, and the Gemara says this, and the Rambam says this. But the problem? The problem is you're using sources that the other side does not acknowledge as authoritative. So you say, oh yeah, that's the Talmudic rabbis twisting things again. I mean, there's always going to be a problem. In other words, I'm trying to prove my point from a Chazal, and the other side doesn't accept Chazal. So a Karaite is actually in a good position to refute Christianity, because the Karaite didn't use Chazal, didn't use Midrashim, didn't use anything, just used the biblical text to show that if you understand the grammar and the syntax and the history and the background and the context, you will see that these Christological interpretations are not emes. That's a stronger argument. I mean, I don't mean intrinsically. Obviously Chazal is a stronger argument, but it's a more persuasive argument, you see, because that's an argument you can use even accepting the premises of the other side, meaning you believe in the biblical text. You believe the Bible is holy. Well, I'll show you that the Bible does not mean and cannot mean what you say. So this is a work that is used by rabbis to this day. It is used by people that are involved in anti-missionary activity called Chizuk Emunah, and it was authored by a Karaite. He doesn't say anything in the book against Chazal. He just ignores Chazal. In other words, he does not mention Chazal in the book at all. And he goes through Bible. He goes through the context of the biblical verses to show you what those psukim are. So it is interesting that in spite of the fact that Karaites were Kofrim, and according to this, Ein lo Chelek liolam haba, because they were Kofer in Torah Shabbal Peh, nevertheless, they did develop an expertise in particular areas, and our own Chachamim were willing to draw on that expertise for positive reasons. Yeah.
So does any of what the Karaites and Chizuk Emunah contradict stuff Chazal said?
No. It's considered to be a kosher book, maybe by a non-kosher author, but it basically just goes through what you might call pshuto shel mikra, on the level of pshat, going through, which by the way is not a bad idea anyway. On one hand, that gets us into another controversy I don't want to address. One of the questions, and actually it's a live controversy now because there's a book on Chumash that's being banned for that very reason, that you'll notice that sometimes Rishonim, and certainly sometimes Achronim as well, will offer an explanation of a pasuk, which is not the explanation that Chazal gave to a pasuk. They'll give a pshat in the pasuk that's Keneged Chazal, not in a matter of halacha, but in a matter of how to understand the narrative, how to understand the story. And even very great people do this. The Ibn Ezra does it quite a lot. The Ramban does it sometimes. Even Rashi does it sometimes, although not that much. The Ibn Ezra does it a lot, the Barbanel does it a lot, and the like. And the question is, we scratch our head and we say, well, wait a second, even an Amora can't argue with a Tana, and a Rishon can certainly not argue with an Amora, and none of us could argue with any of them, so how could it be that the Ibn Ezra comes across and offers an explanation that is different than the explanation Chazal gives? How could he say a different explanation? And the short answer is, the simple answer is, although you'd have to take every single example, is that this is what we call shivim panim la Torah, meaning to say Torah itself can be understood in many, many, many ways. Now Chazal give us an explanation, and that explanation is 100% true. But just because it is 100% true doesn't mean that's the only explanation. There are multiple levels. Chazal talk about 70 layers to the Torah. Others talk about 4. Pardes, the garden. Pardes is an abbreviation, means an orchard or a garden, but there's pshat, which is the simple meaning, then there's remez, then there's allusions, then there's a drash, like midrashim, then there's sod, that's Kabbalah. So they're all true. The fact that the pshat is understanding the words differently than the sod doesn't mean the pshat is right and the sod is wrong, or the sod is right and the pshat is wrong. They're all right. So when Rishonim are offering, and even Achronim, and I dare say even you yourself, you have rishus to do this. No hate mail, please. But you do have rishus to do this, as long as you acknowledge the ultimate truth of Chazal on whatever level they're giving it. You can understand Pshuto Shel Mikra in your way as well. Again, understanding that you don't contradict. In other words, you may say something different than Chazal, but you're not contradicting the ultimate truth of what they are revealing. So going back, this is a long-winded answer to your question. So Chizek Emunah may interpret verses not like the drushes of Chazal, but in that sense, they're just doing Pshuto Shel Mikra, the same way the Malbim and the same way, Rashi and Radak will sometimes explain Psukim without the Medrash. Rashi will say, there is a Medrash on this Pasuk, but I will give you Pashut Pshat. Rashi himself says that. Again, Rashi does not do it as much as, let's say, the Ibn Ezra. In fact, that's why the Ramban was critical. The Ramban, when the Ramban wrote his great Perush on Chumash, right, which is considered to be second only to Rashi himself, so there weren't that many Meforshim on Chumash then. There was the library of Chumash commentary was much smaller. So the two main commentaries that preceded the Ramban was Rashi's commentary and the Ibn Ezra. Those were the two Meforshim that the Ramban had when he wrote his Perush. And in the Hakdama, he writes, I'm going to use both of these Perushim with respect to Rabbeinu Shlomo, that's Rashi, Rabbeinu Shlomo, he says, all I have is kavod and admiration, and I will bow down to his words, and everything is wonderful, although he argues with Rashi too, but he says, only respect and reverence. With respect to Rabbi Avram Ibn Ezra, he quotes a verse in Mishlei that talks about open rebuke to a friend with hidden love, meaning, I like the guy, but I'm going to rebuke him, which means he criticized the Ibn Ezra a lot. And a lot of the criticism is because the Ibn Ezra maybe was considered to be a little too freewheeling in simply departing from Chazal. But the emes is, I can't say I fully understand Ramban's problem, because the truth is Ramban does it too and Rashi does it too. I mean, the Ibn Ezra may do it quantitatively more. But the methodology is a common methodology. And that's why even if Chizek Emunah, going back to your question, even if Chizek Emunah offers explanations that are not according to Chazal, they're not really contradictory. And it's considered to be a kosher book. And as I say, a Karaite in particular is a very effective anti-missionary person, primarily because he's only using sources that the other side considers to be legitimate. Right? If you try to refute from Chazal, you have an uphill battle because they don't accept Chazal. So why should they listen to what Chazal says? Like telling an atheist, you have to believe in God. And the atheist says, why? He says, because the Torah says you have to believe in God. How can you, a guy doesn't accept. So how is that going to convince him? Yeah.
I understand how at times that there could be different interpretations and different levels of meaning, but it's possible when there are times that the Pshuto Shel Mikra contradicts in some way what like Chazal said. Like I know there are a number of examples of this. One example I can think of is like how in like Megillah, the Megillah says that Mordechai took Esther Lulabat, and Chazal say not Labat, but Lulabai. That was his wife.
Your wife, yeah.
So I don't understand when the Pshuto Shel Mikra necessarily come in contradiction with what Chazal says.
Well, once again, actually there's a very, very excellent sefer, and it's too bad because the title is the same as another sefer, which is also excellent, but banned, and this one is not banned. Meaning, there is a sefer Pshuto Shel Mikra that right now is going through a lot of controversy. Although I will say it's an excellent sefer, but that's controversial. But there's another sefer with the exact same title called Pshuto Shel Mikra, which is not controversial, and it's accepted, and there's no cherem against it. So in a way, maybe Michlala, it was written by the founder of Michlala, Rav Yehuda Kuperman Zichrono Livracha. So maybe Michlala might think of changing the title just to avoid this controversy. But in Rav Kuperman's Pshuto Shel Mikra, he has a truly, truly, truly excellent discussion of how do we deal with pshat when it is not just an extra interpretation, but it contradicts. Now, you gave one example, and I'll answer your example. But the example he gives is ayin tachas ayin. The Torah says, I knock out your eye, I knock out your tooth. So what does the Torah say? Literally, it says, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. That means I knocked out your eye, you knock out my eye. I knock out your tooth, you knock out my tooth. That's what it says. That's called the lex talionis, and Christians like to make a big deal about how barbaric, Old Testament morality was until Yeshivat came along and fixed everything. Now, all of us know that Chazal have an interpretation in the 8th Perek of Bava Kama, that ayin tachas ayin does not mean an eye for an eye, but it refers to compensation, that if, God forbid, you took out somebody's eye, you must pay the value of the eye. How do you assess the value of an eye? So it says you use a hypothetical slave market, meaning how much would you go for as a 2-eyed slave, and how much will you go for as a 1-eyed slave? And the difference is the economic value of the eye. When you have a slave market, you can actually assess price differentials in that particular way. Now, we accept that. We accept, when I read the words ayin tachas ayin, it means money. But the question is, why did the Torah write an eye for an eye if that's not what it means? Here, the pshat, meaning the simple meaning of the words, contradicts what we believe is the true meaning, right? How do you reconcile it? So he brings from different svarim, the Gra, the Meshech Chachma, they all point out that the Torah is stressing that ideally, when a person knocks out somebody's eye, his eye should be forfeited, but the Torah has accepted kind of a ransom of money. So sometimes the pshat is telling you the ideal, and that's important. If the Torah just would have said, I knock out your eye, I pay money, that just would have taught me that. But by saying ayin tachas ayin, it's actually expressing the ideal of what should have been, but Hashem is giving you a break. So pshat is communicating that. Now, in your example of Bas and Bayit, I would simply say that these are complementary, valid interpretations. Mordechai was much older than Esther. He married her. She was his wife, and she was also like his daughter that he raised. I mean, I can tell you, I know this myself because friends of my parents, an older man lost his wife in the Holocaust, and he was not able to take care of himself, so his niece married him, which is permitted, and she was many, many years younger. So essentially, it is possible in that type of situation where it's kind of a combination of husband-wife, father figure, and daughter. Such a mitzias does exist, and one might say that those are the two readings of the pshat and the trash. So both of them are emes on that level. Yeah.
That famous Vilna Gaon about ayin tachat ayin, can that be used as an argument or proof against those who say it's not what it is?
Well, again, the Vilna Gaon has a whole board, but once again, somebody might just, in terms of pshat simply means what do the words say, right? So you got to figure out a way to deal with pshat. Yeah.
You didn't mention that the stimulus to Karaites emerging, whatever, seems to be more political or institutional rather than ideological. Like in the beginning,
in the beginning, for sure.
His position. So, and it seemed like what he was saying was that he was against these yeshivas, the ones that inherited the Torah al-Pei. Did they actually ideologically say there was never any Torah al-Pei, or they just say it's been corrupted by the system?
So this is an interesting point, and this is, I think, might be what the Rambam is picking up in the two prongs. Remember, he has 2 and 3, right? The first one is denying the divine origin of the written Torah, but with respect to the oral Torah, the Rambam has 2 statements. One is he denies the oral Torah, and the other is he denies the authority or legitimacy of the transmitters of the oral Torah. Remember the 2, that's 2 and 3. And I think what he's getting at is exactly what you're saying, that it could be that Anan said, it's hard for Anan to say there never was an oral Torah. I mean, is Anan saying that the Tanoim were, everything was corrupt? But Anan is making the argument that even if there was some type of interpretation, it got corrupted. Chazal say, Kol ha-posel v'mumahu posel, meaning whenever you attack somebody for a fault, that means you have that fault. So Anan is saying the halachic system was politically motivated. Of course, the motivation for him to say that is his political motivation.
So when there's some situation where you have to use oral Torah, like shechting animals or something, they
I'm going to have to check. I don't know what Karaites do about. I mean, they do keep. They won't eat chazer and they won't eat shellfish because that's in the Chumash. What do they do about ritual slaughter? I'd have to check because without a torah shebal peh, you literally don't have a process. Now, I will tell you an interesting thing. So the Karaites don't have an oral law, right? Don't have torah shebal peh. It's interesting. They wear tzitzis because that's in Bamidbar. They don't wear tefillin. Why don't they wear tefillin? It's interesting how people think Karaites are always literal interpretation. They use figurative because they say when the Torah says you shall bind these words on your arm and on your head, they say that means divine wisdom should be in your physical strength and in your mind. It's not referring. But Dafka, they make a dresser, right? They're making a medrash on tefillin. So Karaites wear talis. I think they even have techelas. So if you wear techelas, people will call you a Karaite. But they do not wear tefillin, and they don't blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah because they interpret the phrase Yom Truah. The Torah doesn't say the word shofar on Rosh Hashanah; it only says it by the Jubilee year. Yom Truah means a day of shouting, a day of prayer. They do not blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah. So it's quite an amazing thing. They start counting the Omer the Sunday after Pesach. Because the Torah says you shall start counting the day after Shabbos. We interpret Shabbos to mean the first day of Pesach, and we start counting the second day of Pesach. They start Mimacharas HaShabbos on Sunday. Now, that already goes all the way back to the Tzdukim, because the Mishnah itself says that's what the Tzdukim did, so in that sense, they're heirs to the Tzdukim, yeah.
How did such a guy that could have been like the head of one of these yeshivas been so like easy to just do things that are like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, again, I want to emphasize if he was a serious candidate. I mean, I don't know a lot about him, but if he was a serious candidate to be the Gaon of Surah, that means he was Gadol Hador material. I mean, that's a pretty big position. There is no yeshiva in the world today that would be comparable to the authority over the whole Jewish world that the yeshiva of Surah had. I mean, all the countries that there were Jews would ask shilas to the Gaonim of Surah and the like. I think the Musar is, and this is a very powerful Musar, the Musar exactly is how much kavod can destroy you. You have a desire for kavod, a desire for honor and glory. You could be the greatest person in the world. It's going to pull you down. It's going to destroy you. You can abandon everything because of this. That's a great musar. If you had a person who was just ignorant and didn't know any Torah, and he left Yiddishkeit, that would be sad, but it wouldn't be the same tragedy. Here you had a person who was very, very great. In a way, it's kind of a waste of all of his education. I mean, he knew Shas, then he just threw it away and did his own thing. So one thing I'll tell you, I was once wandering in the Harvard Library, Widener Library, which is actually one of the greatest libraries in the world, and they have a huge amount of svarim. I've always thought, Chazal say, Hakol toli b'mazel. Everything is totally on mazel, even the Sefer Torah, where Sefer Torah winds up. You wonder. Some shasin get to be in a yeshiva where people learn them all the time, and some shasim are in university libraries where, not that many people even come across them. So you almost feel sorry for the Sefer, like, why is this Sefer here? Why can't it be here? And the like. That's Kadosh Baruch Hu Sashkacha. Which Svarim wind up where? But as I was wandering through the shelves of Svarim, I came across the section called Karaite literature, which is something we don't really have much here. And I wanted to look at a Karaite siddur. They have, their prayer book is called the siddur. I guess they stole that word from us. And the question becomes, what will be in a Karaite siddur, right? So you don't have Birchas HaTorah, you don't have Birchas HaShachar. You have a lot of Tehillim. Some of it overlaps with Psukei D'Zimra, some of it is just Tehillim. And there's the recitation of Shema, but no brachos before and after. And then there's no Shemona Esrei, because all of that is rabbinic, all of that is from Chachamim. But they have long poetic compositions of Karaite rabbis over the centuries. Now, that is a very interesting idea, because when Karaitism says, we don't believe in Torah Shebaal Peh, we don't believe in Chazal, we don't believe in Chachamim, that can't really be true, because you have to have Chachamim that interpret things. Even if you're a Karaite, you need a rabbi, you need a Karaite rabbi to interpret, meaning it's impossible not to have something of interpretation. So it really means we don't believe in your rabbis, we have our rabbis, which means it's not really a denial of the interpretation. In other words, it's not that they say it is illegitimate to interpret the written Torah. That's an impossible statement to make. Rather, they say your interpretation is not legitimate, our interpretation is legitimate. So that's a whole different point. It then becomes a power grab in which I don't like you, I'll go with me. But it's not really an ideology. We reject interpretation of the biblical text. It is not shayach, it is not possible. First of all, lahavdil, that's even true in secular law. Like a person's, I reject the Supreme Court interpreting the Constitution. Well, I'm sorry, somebody has to interpret it one way or the other when cases come up. There is no such thing, even in secular law, as a written text that does not need some form of interpretation and application. And even the Karaites had their own interpretations and applications, right? But it wasn't miyusad on Chazal. So that was a little bit of an eye-opener, that Karaites have their rabbis, have their teachers, have their scholars, have their interpretations and the like, but over the years they have diverged.
I got a little bit stuck on the earlier point about how the Rambam only wrote a work in response to the danger of the Karaite influence.
Well, I didn't say only, but that's part of why he's
writing. Christianity, because it wasn't a local problem. Was there some mutual agreement between all the leaders that believe that they have to deal with the influences and issues of it? I can imagine you probably had an exchange of letters, let's say, somebody from the Christian world.
Well, remember, the Rambam's opinion is Christianity is idolatry. The Rambam does say Christianity is idolatry. It's not that he doesn't address that. But all I'm saying is that the immediate problem, we look at the Rambam, and rightfully so, as the eternal figure that is speaking to us. But the Rambam was also a communal leader. The Rambam was a Rav. The Rambam was a leader of his community. And the Rambam was not only speaking to the anonymous eternity, the Rambam was dealing with a here and now series of problems. And the here and now problem that he was facing in Egypt was the Karaites. And he had to deal with that. He had another problem, by the way, which may be less important, but the Rambam was bothered by that as well. This is a total digression, but I'll mention it because it's another problem the Rambam meant. Do you remember, did you ever learn, and I think I mentioned it too, that the original minhag of Kriyas HaTorah in Eretz Yisrael was you would finish the Torah in the 3-year cycle. You wouldn't do it in a 1-year cycle. It would be a 3-year cycle, which means Bereshis would be read over 3 weeks, and then Noach 3 weeks, etc. And you'd finish the Torah 3 years. And by the way, when you finish the Torah, it wasn't necessarily Simchas Torah. It was Shavuos or Pesach. There are different ways of calculating a 3-year Torah reading cycle. Now, the minhag of Bavel, from the time of the Amoraim already, was 1-year cycle. Eventually, what happened was that the Eretz Yisrael cycle got totally nispatel, and nobody was doing it anymore. Nobody does it today. The Reform movement has a 3-year cycle, but even they are not doing it that way. They'll read a third of Breitowitz, and the next week a third of Noach. That's not the way the 3-year cycle worked. So eventually, the Eretz Yisrael minhag got nispatel, and everybody did the 1-year cycle. So the Rambam was faced, however, with a kehila of Jews who were Yardim. They had moved from Eretz Yisrael to Egypt, and they decided, as a way of connecting themselves to Eretz Yisrael, they kept the old 3-year cycle. There was a minyan in Cairo that was reading the Torah on a 3-year cycle. And the Rambam felt that was a great threat. Now, why? Not so much, see, you have to understand the problem. Not so much because it was a violation of Kriyas HaTorah, but rather it was a refusal to accept the final psak of the Talmud Bavli, that you go for 1 year. So this was also a Karaite type of thing. And these were not Karaites, but it was the same thing. The Rambam was very vigilant when people were not accepting the Talmud, were not accepting the Gemara, and he felt that he fought very vigorously to have that minyan shut down and discontinued. So I think that's also an example where, and you have to remember too, another thing. The Gemara was not as old as it is now. I mean, the Talmud Bavli was finished as a work around the year 700. So by the time the Rambam is around, the Gemara as a work, even though obviously it has elements going back to Moshe Rabbeinu, but the Gemara as a work is less than 500 years old. And there were pockets who didn't accept it. The Karaites were the biggest movement that rejected it, but there were even religious Jews that did not totally accept it. After all, I mean, think about it this way. There were communities, even in Europe, before 700. They had their minhagim already. Then this big book called the Talmud Bavli shows up and tells them, oh, you're doing it wrong. There were communities we would call them from. They did not accept this. They did not accept the Talmud Bavli completely. They said, we have our own minhagim. So a lot of what the Gainim were to try to have the Talmud Bavli accepted as the Messiah of Torah Shebaal Peh, and the Rambam a little later had to make the same fight. So the same fight he has against the Karaites, he also has against the minyan that is doing a 3-year Kriyas HaTorah cycle, because this was a big threat that if the Gemara would not be accepted as authoritative Torah Shebaal Peh, that would wreak havoc on the Messiah. That's why the Rambam says it's Ein Lo Chelek L'Olam Haba, Makchish Magida, you deny the authority of the teachers of Torah Shebaal Peh.
So what I understand is that in the times of, to the Rambam, like those who were like a threat to Torah were like the Karaites and medium, or whatever you want to say.
Yeah.
Nowadays, I would think that like our modern day version of that would be like, let's say, like the Reform, Conservative, maybe even, I don't know, maybe Orthodox, I don't know. But from my understanding is that generally the poskim like view Reform or conservative individuals nowadays, at least people
Yeah. So here I want to say before we end, I just want to say one thing, and I'm going to talk about it more tomorrow. The Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim literally means the laws of rebellious people. That's where the Rambam further talks about Apikorim. Besides here, he talks about it there. And the Rambam addresses Karaites. And the Rambam says that a Karai is a Kofrim b'Torah. He doesn't mention that, he doesn't single them out here, but by definition that would be true here too. A Karai is a Kofrim in Torah Shebaal Peh, and Ein Lo Chelek L'Olam Haba. But then the Rambam says the following. This is really important. This only applies to the original generation of the Karaites who had learnt the Torah Shebaal Peh and were raised in the Torah Shebaal Peh, and they rejected it. But the children and the later generations of the Karaites, the Rambam writes, who were never exposed to the Torah Shebaal Peh, are like, the Rambam says, Tinok Shenishba, like a captive baby raised among the Gentiles, and they are not responsible for their deviations, and there's a mitzvah to welcome them, to be makarev them, to take care of them. Now the Rambam is writing about the Karaim. He is not writing about conservative or Reform Jews, but the application of that principle to the modern non-religious Jew is very, very apparent, and that would be the yesod. So when you hear people talk about Tinok Shenishba, it's not a modern idea. It is actually based on the Rambam's differentiation between the original Karaites and the children of the Karaites. So by the Rambam's time, the original Karaites, I mean, they weren't there. In the Rambam's time, you're dealing with... but still, keep in mind that in spite of the Rambam's compassion, he is still fighting against their ideology, meaning he is not condemning the individual, but he is saying that, we can't accept what they stand for. Okay, stop here.